Hello and welcome to another Looney Tunes review video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to follow my journey to review all 1000 classic Looney Tunes shorts and give this video a like as well. So this is a review for Gold Diggers of 49, released in 1935. It's the 116th in the series and is directed by Tex Avery. You can find this restoration on the Looney Tunes Gold Collection Volume 5 DVD set and on the Porky Pig 101 DVD set, and I have links below to those sets. It is under copyright. You will not find this short on YouTube unless Warner Brothers themselves choose to upload it, which I doubt due to a few scenes having some ethnic stereotypes. It is what it is, of course. But in case you haven't seen this one, it's 1849. Beans is at the Red Gulch to mine for gold. Little Kitty tells her father, Porky Pig, which is kind of weird, but anyway, he tells him about the discovery. And so the whole town sets out to find the gold, and later on a villain tries to steal some of it and the chase is on. So for this review, I'm going to go through some trivia and then we'll go through the short from start to finish, going through all the references. My good friend S.C. MacPeter, he's going to make a few comments about this short, which I will put all throughout this review, putting this short into context as well, because it's not only important because, hey, Tex Avery is here, but it's also important in the history of the Warner Brothers shorts, because if Tex Avery hadn't arrived, we would have been on a very different trajectory. But the big trivia for this one, in case you weren't aware, this is the first credited short for Tex Avery as a director at Warner Brothers. Now, this is not the first short he's directed, period. He did direct a few shorts at Walter Lantz, although it was uncredited. There was one that he unofficially directed, there was one that he did direct. But SC is actually more familiar with Tex Avery's time at Walter Lantz Studios, so he'll just go through that right now.
Hello, this is SC talking about Tex Avery's first cartoon directed at the Leon Schlesinger studio, Gold Diggers of 49. It began production around May of 1935, and according to a surviving layout, was finished by August 19th, 1935. It was directed by Tex Avery, as I had mentioned, written with him by Cal Howard, who he worked with at the Walter Lantz studio and recruited over to join him. And credited animators are Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones, a pair of ambitious young animators who joined the Avery unit when it started. And Tex brought 3 animators from the Walter Lantz studio with him. He brought Virgil Ross, who became one of the mainstays, Sid Sutherland, who was a mainstay of the Avery unit, and then I'm not really sure what happened to him afterwards. It seems like he may have gotten drafted and didn't return, something of the matter. And there was also Cecil Surrey, who eventually, while working in animation, moved more towards managing studios like at UPA. He shows up in some UPA credits during the 50s. But going into this short, Tex Avery got the job to direct cartoons at Schlesinger during the 1935-36 season of cartoons, along with Jack King for the black and white Looney Tunes, but very quickly rose up the ranks by making, frankly, superior cartoons, as I'm sure everyone will agree. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean Avery's arrival was the most allotted. Clampett seemed to feel that he wanted the position better, and he even asked Schlesinger, hey, can I do one picture of my own? But I get the impression Schlesinger felt that he wasn't ready just yet, whereas Avery, while never credited, did have direction experience. While he said himself he only directed 2 cartoons, everyone else's account, while varying, it paints the picture that he began as a co-director on several Oswalds around 1933, having begun work on them at the Winkler studio sometime in 1928-29, moving over the Lances when he took over the Oswald contract for Universal, doing them in-house as the studio was owned by Universal during that period, and always submitting gags and animating by 1930. Now, as an assistant director, he would have handed scenes to animators as well as work on story and timing, it appears, where of course his boss and the guy who seemed to have inspired him a lot, Bill Nolan, would have been the official director. Nolan left sometime in 1934, perhaps because of the cost of having 2 producers, as well as starting to fall out of style in animation, as he couldn't necessarily adapt to more complex animation. He was credited for Rubber Hose. But back to Avery, it seems that after Nolan left, Avery took over the position of directing the Oswald cartoons, at least some of them. So it appears that in several 1934 and 35 titles, such as Christopher Columbus Jr., Elmer the Great Dane, The Hillbilly, and others where Avery is credited, and as well as other people that would have been in his unit, such as Ray Abrams, Laverne Harding, Virgil Ross. Those are Tex Avery pictures, the very first ones, and it looks like even there his habit of focusing on one picture and then cooling off only to do another cartoon that would advance his timing, which he was still trying to focus on even early then while prioritizing actually funny gags, becomes very evident. At Lance, I think he directed Christopher Columbus Jr., which appears to be his earliest parody of historical timeline, doing a mock-up of Christopher Columbus's trip to America. He then did Elmer the Great Dane later, which appears to be a cartoon, very much in the Avery gag style of do gags, of trying to fix a problem and they don't fix it with a twist at the end. It ends really funny where you think that this dog has been cured of his hiccups after all these attempts fail, but no, they all still affect him. And he has the cuckoo clock, there's popcorn being made inside of him. That has to be Tex Avery. Most notably, he directed a cartoon called Town Hall Follies. Town Hall Follies is significant in that it really does feel like an Avery venture where he finally succeeds in making a really good cartoon, full of gags, suspense, and structure and pacing. I'll get into this later, and I'm sure Anthony will agree with me. This cartoon is really good at the very least of having formal structure and pacing, even if the timing can be off on some gags. I do genuinely believe that Avery was a director, a very formal but uncredited director at the Lance studio, and that's how he got the job at Schlesinger, because he genuinely did have experience, even if he didn't have the credit on screen and may have been embarrassed later on about those cartoons. But I don't know, I don't think that bad. But it's clear that he had the experience to take it over, and he showed it off very well in this entry.
And if you watch those shorts, you can sort of see hints of things to come. He definitely had a different way of seeing how a cartoon short could be made, and he was always looking to push the boundaries. So here, if you've been watching these reviews, you'll notice that there are things that start to creep in that feel more like the Warner Brothers way of doing things as opposed to the Disney way, because Disney were king, and who else were you going to follow? You're going to follow the most successful studio, right? The only other studio around this time that got anywhere close to Disney was the Fleischer Studio, with their Popeye shorts and Betty Boop shorts being incredibly popular. But now with Tex Avery at the studio, we're going to see another studio rise up and be considered one of the best. Because at this point, and in case this is your first review, we're at a point in time where Leon Schlesinger, the producer, broke ties with the previous cartoon makers, Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising, made his own studio. He brings over a whole bunch of ex-Disney animators and directors and tries to push a character known as Buddy, you know, the world's greatest character. But there was definitely a lot of issues earlier on, including directors who shouldn't even be directors in the first place. The character wasn't particularly interesting. You had many changes in directors and animators. Just because you bring over people that are talented, if you don't have someone with a strong vision, there's not really much you can do. Things will just flounder for a bit, and that's exactly what happened. That's not to say that nothing good came out around this time. There were definitely some interesting highlights, like there were a few shorts by Earl Duval, for example, but he got fired because he got into a drunken argument with Leon Schlesinger. So they continued to push for Buddy to be the star. Nothing was working, so he was retired, and now they're trying to have Beans as the main character, which in hindsight, yes, it's not a particularly great idea. So at this point, as mentioned, Beans was being pushed by the studio's next big star.
I will give some credit to Jack King at least. It seems like he was forced to do the Beans cartoons where, in Clampett's account, Schlesinger and Freeling felt that Beans would be the best star, perhaps because he had the most Mickey-like appeal. I guess going for proper characterization was a revolutionary idea that Avery himself approached, where the characterization would really sell a cartoon more than just, well, being good. Even then, the Beans cartoons, they don't really say much, but I imagine when Avery got the assignment to do this cartoon and he realized he had to work with another Oswald-type character, I get the impression he was just bored of that sort of archetype and really wanted to work against it, while still pleasing his boss, of course, and he does a really good job here, but Beans, yeah, he didn't really have the appeal. By this point, every Mickey lookalike, it's just like they couldn't come up with anything new at this point. Beans is just another one of those characters, and it really says a lot that they got rid of the character very quickly. But I feel bad for Jack King because, I mean, he didn't really have the direction to do good cartoons. As I've mentioned, directed very flat cartoons. I'm going to be making comparisons with this cartoon later on to Hollywood Capers, because I feel like comparing the structure between this cartoon and that one will really dive into just how important Avery's arrival was, and it really would have been detrimental to history if he didn't get this position. But at the very least, there's a lot of good in this cartoon.
But here, Avery does the clever thing where no doubt he would have been told by the studio to push Beans as the character, so as a new employee, I figure he's just doing the right thing to keep his job, of course. So he uses Beans as like a Mickey Mouse type character where he is surrounded by all these funny characters and situations, which, to be fair, if you're going to push Beans as a character, that's what you do. But one of the characters here is Porky Pig, as we all know, because you can tell that Avery sees something in Porky as being a completely different character than what's out there. And it's Porky's second appearance. Now here, he's redesigned from the school kid that we saw in I Haven't Got a Hat to this massive, overweight adult character, still voiced by real-life stutterer Joe Doherty, but he actually sounds like Porky's dad that will come out in the few shorts after this. So you will also notice that the character's look is going to change between the different units. So while they have a rough idea of what Porky Pig actually is, the different units would approach it completely differently. Nonetheless, Avery did make the right call, as we can see in hindsight, because we'll see Beans in a few more shorts, but when it became apparent that Porky was a breakout character and the audiences were responding to him, Beans was retired, and Porky ends up becoming the first major star for the Schlesinger Studios. The title itself is a reference to two musicals that were very popular around this time. So we have the Gold Diggers of 33 and Gold Diggers of 35, and they were released by Warner Brothers. It's also referring to the Californian Gold Rush. Now, I'm not sure if Tex Avery intended the title to refer to the other meaning of gold digger, which is referring to a woman marrying someone just for their money.
I'm sure the animators got quite a laugh at this title because, yeah, it's parodying Warner Brothers' Gold Digger pictures, where that indeed is the whole joke of them. But interestingly enough, I believe besides that, of course, the reference to the real gold rush and the very racist joke of changing Chinese stereotypes to blackface stereotypes, where they become Amos and Andy later on.
Of this year, gold reproposition.
There's almost no pop culture references in this cartoon, but there's a little bit of that. But I think it made a good impression that he could show that he didn't need real pop culture references. Like some of the gags in the Freeling cartoons are really reliant at this period of knowing what they're referencing, as well as the Jack King cartoons, like especially Hollywood Capers, which relies on you knowing who those famous stars are, which wouldn't have been an issue back then, but it does show that there was almost a feel of limitation with where cartoon boundaries were at this time. I think 1935 was a really, really dry year all around for the studios, where they were just still adjusting to making beautiful color pictures, but they were just dried out from the sound cartoons, and they needed something like Avery and the Snow White boom, which caused a big uproar in cartoon production. It just got really dry around this period. Besides Disney and the Popeyes from Fleischer and some of the Schlesinger cartoons, it's really hard to name a lot of favorites from 35 outside of that. But, I mean, it's really great that Avery came along, and take it again, Anthony.
So what we'll do now is go through the short from start to finish, and we'll go through some of the other references all throughout. And one thing you will notice as going through this short, it's not as though there was a light switch and Tex Avery was completely the Tex Avery that he's more famous for. Like any good director, the first few shorts he directs, there are definitely some raw elements. He's still figuring things out, and that's perfectly fine. But I would argue that this is still miles ahead compared to the majority of shorts in 1935 and 34 for that matter, at least coming out from this studio. And we can even see some of the origins of what Avery would end up doing in his later career too. So for the vocal credits for this one, because at this point, voice artists don't get credited on these shorts, so you have Bernice Hansel doing Little Kitty, which is pretty typical. She would voice a lot of these really cutesy type characters that were around in the 30s. You have Tommy Bond doing the voice of Beans like he did before. Joe Doherty, as I already mentioned, does the voice of Porky Pig, and he'll do so for the next couple of years before he would end up being replaced by Mel Blanc, who could actually control his stutter. Billy Bletcher doing the voice of the villain, because who else is going to voice a villain in these shorts, right? And Keith Scott, in his wonderful Cartoon Voices book, where all this information comes from, he's not sure on the vocal trio. He thinks it may be the Californians, but he's not sure. So he's got a question mark on that. But it's always interesting to see what's to come. If you look at the credits here, you can see both Bob Clampett and Charles Jones, aka Chuck Jones, who were animators in Avery's unit before later on they would end up being part of a different unit, which would end up becoming the Bob Clampett unit and so on. So it's interesting to see their earlier works as animators before they ended up going on doing their own thing as directors. But right away as we open up, you can really see that Avery puts a lot of thought in this. I mean, first of all, the music you hear is rural rhythm, and I like the rendition of it here. There's an emphasis on rural rhythm every time Avery zooms into something. I thought it was a nice touch. And you would have heard Rule Rhythm a few times in these Warner Brothers shorts anyway. It's one of the staples that Carl Starling would end up using once he takes over. But within a span of a few moments, you can already tell what's going on, that there's no gold here because the gold in Goldville has been crossed out.
As we open in on Ville, no longer Goldville, we immediately see what sets this cartoon very much apart from everyone else. There's structure, and it's setting up the gold digger story, and there's even humor in it. And as Anthony pointed out, you hear rural rhythm, which I assume had to have been a choice by the staff that they passed on to Norman Spencer and Bernard Brown, who did all the music work on these cartoons, because I can't really see them doing that on their own. And one other thing that you will notice besides these structures, there's less tighter drawing in the Avery cartoons at this point. Avery himself never felt too confident about his drawing, even though I sincerely believe he actually was. So in this early period, he had Bob Clampett and I think sometimes Chuck Jones do the final layouts for him based on his rough sketches. Well, at the very least, the character poses, but you'll also notice that the 3 animators that Tex Avery brought with him haven't necessarily adjusted to drawing the Schlesinger characters, and you'll notice several times in this cartoon that they draw the characters a little odd. They draw them more like Lance characters, especially one of those last shots where Porky is pacing back and forth and the car comes by. It genuinely looks like Porky is a Lance character in that shot. It actually surprised me because of the small little eyes and the more profile-based head, but they adjusted very quickly and they were making good cartoons, I have to say. But back to Anthony.
So even though this is Tex Avery's quote-unquote first time directing something, yes, I know he directed stuff over at Lance, I know, he was already implementing these wonderful ways of telling a story in the shortest amount of time. But this opening is also very reminiscent of what a lot of the Western films at the time were doing, where they would just establish that this is the time, this is the place, and so on, and Avery's clearly aping that. Then we see the girl, who in this case is Miss Kitty, and we follow her all the way over to a bulletin board of sorts where we see our main character, Beans. If you've been following this channel long enough, you know I love to pause on these things and see what's on here. And we see that Beans, young prospector to hunt gold in Red Gulch. And I love that look of that donkey there, I love that expression. But if you look on the sides, and this is not something that audiences at the time would have known or cared about, but you see here, 7 Birdmen visit Warner Brothers studio. But if you look below that, and this is probably just from some trade article or something about Warner Brothers, but if you look around the bottom, it says here, Page Miss Something. I know that's nothing to do with Page Miss Glory, but it's kind of an eerie coincidence that soon Avery would direct a short called Page Miss Glory, and we see that in this article here for his first director short for Warner Brothers. But yeah, this is just something lying around and just pasting there, because all we need to care about here is that Beans is on the hunt for gold. And again, I don't think Beans is that great of a character, but in this one drawing, in this short, this one drawing is way more appealing than the other 2 solo Beans shorts put together. And that's how great Tex Avery was even in these early days. So little Kitty's all excited that her sweetheart's going to find gold, and she has to tell her dad, who happens to be Porky Pig. No, I'm not going to think about the logic in that one, okay? You guys can make up your own minds about that. But we see Porky Pig, and we hear yet again another rendition of Rural Rhythm, which is, I guess, the theme of this short when it comes to the music. So if you have a chance to watch the short, pay close attention to the music. I think it's an underrated aspect of this one.
We again see Avery doing some great setup, where we immediately set up Kitty's father, Porky Pig. Porky in this short just has Joe Doherty's voice unsped up like an interior dance, but he's immediately set up again as a rural hick with the rural rhythm playing again, and more importantly, him being a hog with that nice, delicious sandwich. He eats it up and he does that beautiful catchphrase that he has in this cartoon. I don't know who would have come up with that, but oh man, it does kind of sell the personality of Porky in this cartoon, and it only works in this cartoon, but it makes it sort of memorable. And then, of course, we get into the gag where Avery is, of course, doing a timepiece, and it's modern. We see the ice boxes here. We see cars throughout this whole cartoon. We even, again, see a more recent shotgun. I'm sure Avery said that was a gag, and it does work in this cartoon. I love the whole joke that Avery did a timepiece full of modern contraptions, done to more extreme effect in a cartoon like Jerky Turkey, where it's in the Pilgrim times and every single joke is about World War II.
And yes, iceboxes were indeed around at that time, because for those who might be younger and not be aware, this is before electrical refrigeration. What do they have to do? They had to use iceboxes. So you would have ice delivery men delivering ice and food would end up being stored. So yeah, they definitely weren't around. This wasn't an invented thing by Tex Avery for this short. They really did exist around this time. And then later on, there'll be electric versions, and the rest is history, of course. But I love the animation of Porky being a glutton here. And if you look at the design here, his feet are very much like Pig's feet here. And that's something that would carry on later, but in slightly different ways. And again, as I mentioned before, Porky would end up being redesigned. In fact, Avery was never really too concerned about consistency when it came to characters anyway. He only cared about what was funny at the time. So in this case, he thought, okay, I needed a side character who's like a father figure. Let's use this pig character and just go with it. And then in the follow-up shorts he did with Porky Pig, he becomes more childlike. He's not thinking in terms of a continuity or anything.
It seems Avery caught on pretty quickly that Porky was his own man. As Avery said himself when he watched the demonstration of I Haven't Got a Hat when Leon ran it for him, he noted the little character of Porky reciting the speech, and he must have seen that there was a personality in that character, that he could do humor with it, that he was a little bit of a cautious character, he was a little wimpish, but you wanted him to succeed and do right. And of course he had a distinctive voice, which Freeling, of course, was pioneering in. Frizz was really trying to do a lot more voices at this time, and I think Avery caught on to that, and he began, instead of just using it for incidental characters, began making them the stars and building that up. And of course that would really take off when Mel Blanc started doing the voices, which I'm very glad he did. But even before Mel, there's still some win in this cartoon, as you'll see, even if it's not terribly timed well.
But you see Porky yelping out the whole whoopee thing. That seems to be similar to what Andy Devine did. He had this very distinct voice, very loud voice. In fact, if you've seen The Woods Are Full of Cuckoos, where you got that hippo character going, "Hiya, Ma," and all that, yeah, that's a similar thing here.
Howdy, Ma! Hi, Pa!
Now, I'm glad that Avery didn't keep this as a character trait for Porky in the future. He just does it here and that's it. It works here, but in future shorts, it would get tired very quickly. So little Kitty goes on and on to her father. Again, weird, but anyway, it goes on and on to Porky about how her sweetheart is out digging for gold, and in one of many Tex Avery trademark jokes, we see the mountain literally cut out in a very weird shape there, which, yeah, you didn't see this sort of thing at the Schlesinger studio up until now. You would see all sorts of bizarre gags, but not in this way.
So here we get some more introduction to Beans, where we already know Beans is out setting for gold, but now we indicate that he's been at it for a really long time with just the mountain split in half. And now we clearly understand that Beans is out for gold, and he has been out for a while, and that he finds it with the slot machine gagged. This is something that Jack King's cartoons did not have. When watching Hollywood Capers, it's never quite established whether or not Beans wants to watch the movies in production or if he just wants to be an actor, which is a really big problem because he also doesn't even talk like he wants to be a part of it, just that he pretends to be an actor, of course. He's one of the Boston Beans. One of the Boston Beans!
Beans is the name. One of the Boston Beans.
But it really does say a lot that in that whole cartoon, they couldn't really establish anything that was going on, and Avery has already established the location, the characters, all within the first real act of this cartoon, and we haven't even really gone into a lot of what makes this cartoon actually good. It's quite clear that there wasn't anything about being put straightforward. There's gags, there's story. It's quite clear that this cartoon was thought out very well, perhaps to be a good first impression, but if that were the case, you would expect the next few cartoons to be a little weaker. They only get better from here as Avery begins to refine himself, so he clearly cared a lot more, and I'm sure Schlesinger saw that because, as we know, he did color Merry Melodies very, very quickly, which I'm sure got onto Jack King and maybe even Freeling's nerves, because I'm sure a project like Old Miss Glory would have been assigned to Freeling if Avery wasn't making such a big impression. And he made a big impression on that cartoon, I'd have to say, even if they didn't try anything like it again. I suspect it was only done just as a thing for Schlesinger to go, well, we made one good cartoon. We made a cartoon that's different from others. But getting back to this cartoon, we have great establishment, and then we get the great montage that looks like a lot of it's animated by the people that Avery brought over, like Virgil Ross and Sid Sutherland. He tried to bring over Lance's female animator who worked within Lance's and Manuel Moreno's unit that did the cartoon classics and some of the other Oswald cartoons. Laverne Harding, who was an amazing talent. Anytime there's really, really cute, appealing artwork that really looks like the characters that are on model or the most that they're supposed to look like, it's usually a Laverne Harding scene. And not only did Avery like her enough to do that, she apparently had a lot of influence over his ideas and refining them. He came back in the 50s there. So clearly there was an important friendship there, which should be established. And he wasn't the only director to love her. In fact, I believe every director at the Lance studio really, really liked her work because she was really good at her job. And she did better than just about all the men that worked there for many decades, to be truthful. It's for the better that she stayed there instead of going to Schlesinger. I don't think she would have worked out there, especially since her production at the Walter Lance studio was Walter Lance.
And sure enough, we don't see him mining actual gold nuggets or anything. No, we had a buried slot machine of sorts. And I guess Beans didn't really have any cash because he used a button to trigger this machine and he ends up winning a lot of gold. I wonder if the slot machines at the time could be fooled with buttons. I wonder if that's a reference to something. If you know more about slot machines, or the earlier kinds at least, the more mechanical ones, definitely let me know in the comments. But we see Beans all excited, yelling out gold, gold, and going into town. That's awfully nice of him though, because a lot of people, if they discovered a whole heap of gold, they would just keep it to themselves, right? And we even see Gold Shop as a title, much like earlier on, the time, the place, the girl, and now gold. But I love how he enters the saloon and he just yells at everyone, there's gold in the hills, and those three characters in unison go, gold?
I found gold in the gulch, boys. Gold in the gulch.
Just love the energy from this particular bit where everyone just goes all gold crazy. I did notice that the designs here seem to be leftover designs for some of the later Buddy and earlier Beans shorts, where it's just these generic characters, so they probably just said, yeah, works for this short, let's just use them. Why redesign? But here's a good example of what I mean by the earlier Tex Avery, where he's still figuring things out, versus later on where his shorts were just directed to perfection. Even if you don't like some of the shorts, you can't deny the fact that they're at least directed to absolute perfection, because Avery was known to direct to the frame. That's how much of a perfectionist he was. Here we see the three people saying gold, they leave, and then you have the bartender leaping over the bar. But here we stay a little bit too long on these desserts before we cut to the next bit. Avery would have most likely cut it a lot more sooner and gone on to the next scene a lot quicker. Or he might have added something where maybe the bartender will come back, quickly eat the dessert that's lying there, and then run away or something. But that's what I mean. That's not to say this bit is bad or poorly timed. It just shows that Avery would constantly improve on these things as he goes along. And his timing would be refined even further. If you look at the next scene, where if you've seen a lot of Tex Avery shorts, you'll know that Avery would subvert expectations here. So everyone's jumping onto their horse, but in the last one, the guy misses and the horse ends up riding him. You know, it's still funny, even though you just know that when Avery would revisit this gag, the timing would be a little bit more tighter. And the next bit I laughed more at, not because of the joke itself, which should be pretty obvious. Again, Avery subverting our expectations, right? With the guy, once he finds out that there's gold, he just walks out with the bathtub, which would have been very heavy. I mean, they're still heavy now, but they would have been even heavier back then. I just like the fact that Beans just decides, I'm going to poke my head into this person having a bath. I guess Beans might be a bit of a pervert, I don't know, but anyway, I thought that was hilarious.
Gold
We then have an unfortunate bit regarding the Chinese stereotype, which is going to prevent this short probably from playing on Warner Brothers' YouTube channel or wherever. But keep in mind that there was definitely a sizable Chinese population at the time looking for gold. Not just in the US, but there's even a history here in Australia where there was the gold rush here and there was a sizable Chinese population and they were subject to a lot of persecution and so on. And it is what it is. I'm not going to go into it too much further. It should be pretty apparent that you wouldn't do this sort of thing today, right? In any case, we move on to the barber shop where, again, this is a gag that Avery would revisit numerous times where you would have a character or characters in this case start something, go to do something else, and then realize, oop, we've got to come back and finish what we were doing in the first place.
You're the flower of my heart.
Gold, gold.
That song that they're singing appears to be You're the Flower of My Heart, Sweet Adeline by Harry Armstrong and Richard Gerard.
The song playing here, Sweet Adeline, is a common barbershop quartet song, which is why, of course, it's being sung here. And, of course, it serves a gag where they finish the song. And it's building just on a nice little time gag where they have to run away and then they have to come back.
So Beans finally tells little Kitty that he's found gold. Why he didn't tell them first before the rest of the town, I don't know. But Porky seems excited, and I like how in a split second he's holding a spoon and fork, goes in, and a split second later he's just running out of the door with a pickaxe. So this scene here, again, there's a lot more personality to Beans in this one shot than in all of his other appearances put together. So Beans is about to leave, leaving his girl behind, because girls don't do that kind of stuff, right? They don't go out to the mines. But no, he comes back in and gives her a big kiss. And there's just, again, so much more personality to this character in this short. Does that mean Beans is a great character? No, but it shows that even with the bland characters, you can still do something with them that's interesting. So they hop into an old-timey car, and of course Tex Avery is never concerned with any anachronisms, right? Because while this would have been an older car, even at the time of this short being made, there were no cars as such in 1849. The primary mode of transportation were horses, and I believe even the railroads had started off roughly around this time as well. Any railroad experts can definitely let me know in the comments below, but whatever. It sadly leads to another awful joke where we go from one stereotype to another. So we see those Chinese fellas heading over to the dig, and the black smoke from the car turns them into, well, you can see for yourself, right? And it's not the last time that Avery will do this kind of gag, unfortunately. In any case, we move on to one of the funniest bits here and shows off why audiences would have responded well to Porky in one of the greatest gags where he starts digging for gold and yelling out the whole whoopee thing, where he would reach in, find a piece of gold, put it in his pocket, and then his hand would reach in, he would grab it out of his pocket, and so on and so forth. Alright, so silly things like that I thought was absolutely hilarious. We sadly did not need to see those Chinese stereotypes again, but what can you do?
We get some nice gags establishing Porky's hoggish way of getting gold and getting it out of his pocket. It doesn't go on long enough, and then we get the great treasure that he finds at what they would have called back then a trunk, which is a chest that you would take to carry big luggage around. And now that's what we call the back of cars in America.
So Beans yells out, hey, I found something, bring a rope, pull it down, and they find a box, which, again, it's so weird. You got one bit where you got Beans at a slot machine that he's found, and now he's found gold in a box, which is not how you would typically find gold. It'd be just nuggets, right? Even then, most of the gold you would have found is just little flakes in between hard pieces of rock. It's definitely a lot more involved. Those big nuggets are actually a lot more rarer to find. But in any case, we're not going to get into the whole thing about how to mine gold or anything. But when you actually know how it all works, I think it's even funnier. And speaking of funny, This gag kills me every single time. So this box, you can see some cobwebs and we see a book, How to Find Gold. So the characters look on with great interest and in 3 big words, dig for it. When I first saw this, man, I was in stitches. That is a brilliant joke. Just to think that this is Avery's first directed short at Warner Brothers, and this is only the beginning. Wow. And just the facial expression of Beans in one frame after that, where it's just got that derpy looking face like, huh? That kills me. But I gotta say that the animation in that scene is very crude compared to the other shorts. At this time, yeah, you had Bob Clamper doing some wonderful shots. I think he did the first Porky Pig shot. It looks kind of like what he did. I could be wrong, but then you got other shots like this which are incredibly crude. So yeah, I don't know who would have done this one.
But we get that great How to Find Gold, Dig For It gag, which really has no predecessor in any of the Warner cartoons. So Avery definitely brought a lot. Freeling, he definitely had a lot going for him. I don't think Avery ever gave him ideas of what to do in the cartoons, but I'm sure Freeling caught on right away that if Avery can do this in the cheaper black and white cartoons, then he can bring a little bit of it to the color Merry Melodies. And evidently doing that made those Merry Melodies popular, even if it took a while for Freeling to do that because there were more eyes on the color Merry Melodies than the cheaper Looney Tunes, which is why Avery himself had to tone down his work when he did the Merry Melodies early on. But evidently that method worked, and that's how the Warner cartoon started.
So now we see our villain, again, as I mentioned, voiced by Billy Bletcher. It's unmistakable here. I like how he's looking on through his binoculars and he sees that Beans and Porky are still looking at that book. Guys, it's just 3 words. What's there to read? Go dig for it. In any case, the villain spots the gold and he has his special little shotgun contraption thing. And again, this is the sort of thing that Avery would end up reusing over and over. And he ends up shooting that particular gun thing, and he's pretty good at it. I gotta say, not only is his aim true, but he ends up snatching the bag. So Beans and Porky noticed that the bag had been snatched. This was going to lead to a nice little punchline at the end. And Porky says, if you can get that bag, you can have my daughter. Which, again, if you know the punchline, it's even funnier here once you revisit it.
If you get that bag for me, you can have my daughter.
And the chase is on, and once again, you'd think that Beans would have the upper hand because he's got an actual proper car. It may not be the fastest car that would have ever existed, but still, I'm assuming that car would have been a lot faster than this horse, which, if you look at the villain's horse, again, we're in the transition period where you're going to get some stuff that still looks incredibly crude, but because the short's so funny, you tend to overlook that sort of thing.
You don't think there's a whole chapter in that book about digging for it that wasn't showed up, or at least some nice pictures? Well, anyway, this is another great establishing shot. We get to clearly see a villain, and we even see the importance that Beans and Porky are distracted with their book for him to try and steal the bag. And it's really, really great, again, that there's a little gag in how he gets it by doing something animated rather than just swooping in and picking it up. And of course, he has the little shotgun fishing rod, which is a great little contraption idea. And then Porky immediately just going, if you get that, you can have my daughter. And Beans is out for it, thinking that it's gold, as well as, of course, the villain. And again, we got some tension now after some nice gags. And even here, we have good gags about how the villain avoids Beans's fire. But there really isn't anything that needed Beans for this. This could have been any other character, which would be immediately taken aback by Avery's follow-up cartoons, where I suppose the success of Porky's comedy in this one proved Avery to go, hey, can I do one to try and establish a second star in these cartoons with Porky Pig? And Schlesinger must be like, all right, we've not had much success with Buddy, we'll try anything, and that's where they went. Of course, Porky gets a lot of great gags here, but he's really not the focal point of the story. I have to give Avery the credit where it's due, where even if he doesn't really do a lot of gags with the character, Beans is still the focal point of this cartoon, which you can't really say for Jack King, where Hollywood Capers has to pause to have a musical segment that doesn't involve him in any way. Ditto with A Cartoonist Nightmare in some ways, where there's quite a bit of focus off of Beans to focus on the cartoonist that gets imprisoned by the villains. But here again, we're having a lot more structure. We know what the villain wants to do, unlike in, say, Hollywood Capers, where it just has to be an ape-like Frankenstein who we don't know if he wants to do away with Beans or if he just wants to cause havoc. We don't even really get much of a resolution of what happens to the villain, unlike here where we of course get that the gold is taken, or the lunch, as we find out. We get everything established that, or at the very least, a conclusion that you can be satisfied with.
And I love that brief shot of the villain thinking, yep, with all this money I've got, I'm going to buy this expensive luxury car which doesn't exist. Maybe he just has an active imagination. Maybe he thinks with all this money he can actually develop an automobile while all the suckers ride the railroads at the time. Up until now, the pace has been consistent. Not too slow, not too fast, just right. But here is where things pick up, and this is something that was definitely missed ever since Leon Schlesinger opened up his own studio, and that's the element of speed. And this is something that Tex Avery brings into play here. Now, I would argue that Frank Tashlin later on would take this and go one step further, but still, it's an element that was solely missed. And if you look at the speed here, it's similar to what the Fleischers were doing with their Popeye shorts, where they'll bring a lot of speed into things. But Avery does it his own way. And you got some animation here, which in comparison to some shots looking incredibly crude, you got some shots looking incredibly strong, like that shot of Beans shooting those guns as the windshield goes up and down in time to it. And we see plenty of these speed lines, which again, this is something that Avery is experimenting. Funnily enough, Walt Disney around this time would release a short called The Tortoise and the Hare, where they would experiment with adding speed, especially with that hare running and the speed lines and so on. And yet Avery was doing the same right here, and I would imagine on a much lower budget too. And we get a nice little payoff with the hat being just shot to the point where it ends up becoming this tiny little hat. And I love the expression of the villain just breaking the fourth wall going, yeah, this hat's too small. You know, it's the little things like that which make the short really great. So Beans continues to shoot, and you got to wonder how many bullets are in this gun. I mean, these guns would contain, what, 6 bullets, maybe 8? I'm not familiar with guns or anything. You can let me know if you're a gun expert as to what type of guns those would actually be. But he shoots like a machine gun, opening up the villain's pants, and he has a metal tub on his butt, which is kind of a weird joke. But I do like the expression of the villain. Once it's all exposed, it's like, hey, I thought ahead. I decided to wear this underneath all my clothes for reasons.
I'm not sure necessarily how this sort of gag came to mind. I guess it would have come from Avery and Howard's board, but I'm going to guess Clampett and his ambition may have tried to push this a little bit more, which Clampett definitely was trying to push Avery to do faster comedy while they worked together in the unit. So I'll give Clampett credit for that, because that was certainly the case. And it's clear that the speed gags here were important for Avery because it brought better pacing and it made the gags funnier. I believe, I don't remember who told it, but there's a story where Tex was having a gag session for one of his Oswald cartoons. They had so many gags they wanted to fit in that they ended up making the gags timed a little faster to fit them all in, which only made the cartoon funnier. I'm not sure which Oswald that would have been, but it would have been one from 35 that would have had him and Ray Abrams, Virgil Ross, those kind of people credited on the cartoon. But here it's going the further step. Beans in many of these fast, nicely ink shots, again, has that little bit of a softer look. He again looks like a Lance character in a few of these shots. This is sort of a really wonky drawn cartoon because you're having animators adjust to drawing like Schlesinger characters, and since they're not working directly in the building with the other animators, they can't necessarily follow Bob McKimson, as he was already setting up how to draw the characters very nicely in this era, even if he wasn't working for Avery at this time. By 1936 was likely working exclusively for First Freeling, with maybe a few scenes for Jack King, but I don't think by this point anyone besides Freeling was using Bob McKimson. And I think his expertise would have helped. Virgil Ross definitely owed a lot to drawing from him, but it's still serviceable here. And of course, the inking and the speed really makes up for it. And we even get a really nicely timed bit where he grabs Porky, as I mentioned earlier, he looks like a Lance character, and drags him into the car. Very nicely timed.
Clearly frustrated, Beans puts down the two, again, I think the 6 shooters, and pulls out a shotgun while the villain has his own pistols, and that shot is just incredible. If you slow that right down, the way it turns into the speed spiral is probably what I'll call it, and how all those bullets just fly around everywhere. It's just incredible at this early stage in Tex's directing career at Warner's. So Beans avoids the bullets that he can somehow see, because he's got superpowers, right? He starts shooting the shotgun, but the force is so strong, it ends up pushing the whole vehicle back. Again, in the future, when Avery would revisit this kind of thing, he would definitely tighten up the timing a bit, but it's still pretty funny. But what's this? Beans looks down and sees that his vehicle is now out of gas, and he's also fresh out of luck too, because petrol stations, or gas stations as you Americans call it, wouldn't exist for another 60 years or something after the setting of this short. So yeah, he's definitely fresh out of luck. But lucky for him, the moonshine at this time was particularly potent, and he puts it in the vehicle, and it's so potent that the vehicle ends up turning into a 1930s race car of some sort, or a luxury vehicle of the time. And look at the speed lines. And again, this would have been a case of Avery also figuring things out along with directing, so that makes the short even more incredible. And I love the sound effects too. It sounds like as though it's an aeroplane taking off. I would love to have been part of the audience seeing this short for the first time, because they really would not have seen anything like this. In fact, as I mentioned before with The Tortoise and the Hare from Disney, even they didn't go this far when it came to speed. So we briefly see the villain, and his horse sounds like it's an older car for some weird reason, just for that brief moment, gets knocked over by the car goes around a bend, comes back, Beans grabs the villain, puts him in the car, goes around another bend. One could argue that the scene takes a little bit too long, as impressive as it actually looks, but it's still pretty funny. The car continues racing by a very sad Porky, which again, if you know the twist at the end, it makes this scene even more funnier.
Then we get them swooping past Kitty, which does prove that Avery had the ambitions, and as we get a perfectly satisfying ending where Porky and Beans have a nice conclusion, we get the final gag where Porky, he just wanted his lunch, and the two of them are allowed to get married, which satisfies the beginning. Beans did indeed find some gold, even if he didn't really have some by the end, but it still satisfies the audience because he found gold at the beginning, and he gets to marry Kitty, just for retrieving Porky's lunch of one day. So, at the very least, there's a nice satisfying ending. We get, again, more funny gags involving the pacing and building up. It seems interesting to me that, I think besides Jack King a few times, they really weren't trying to do Boy Saves Girl from Big Brute Villain voiced by Billy Bletcher type cartoons. And it seems whenever Freeling did those cartoons, he always put a twist on it in the ending, or who the villain was, like the octopus and Mr. and Mrs. is the name, or the flies and Why Do I Know It's Sunday. And in Little Dutch Plate, where he does that very straightforward adaptation of it, he has that bizarre ending where he looks like a swooner. I don't know who it's supposed to be still. And the girl starts falling in love with him. And earlier, Bernard Brown's Those Were Wonderful Days is remembered by a friend of mine as, quote, the one where the villain wins. Because at the end of that cartoon, you'll remember that she falls in love with him. But as you can see, there were little signs of what Avery would pioneer in those cartoons, and I'm glad he really brought it here. And again, if you thought that this cartoon was him trying to make a good impression on his new boss, they only get better from here, and the films only become more popular, which is great for him. Maybe not so good for Jack King, who couldn't quite keep up. But that's my take on this cartoon, folks. I hope you agree with me, and I hope you enjoyed this one too.
So again, if you go back to watch the short, knowing the actual twist, it makes a lot of the Porky bits even more funnier. And the fact that he doesn't seem to think much of his daughter, he just wants lunch. But in any case, wow, what a debut by Avery here. Yes, his later shorts would do a lot of the things here a lot better as he directs more and more shorts. I mean, you can't expect perfection out of the gate. If you look at the early works of people like Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Tim Burton, and so on, they would do some great work earlier on, but a lot of it would be quite raw, and they would end up doing things a lot better later on. But here, a lot of the Tex Avery trademarks are already in place. The speed, the weird, sometimes dad joke-like gags, and just very surreal moments that actually make sense. Something which Jack King should have taken note of, considering what goes on in his shorts. But in any case, this one, despite it not being perfect, there are some timing things here and there that don't quite work as well as they should. You know what, this gets 9 out of 10. I love this short. I think it's hilarious, and it's such a strong debut for a master director. It's just a shame we've got those few scenes that would prevent this from being discovered by more people. Yeah, you could cut those bits out technically and still show this, and it would still be pretty safe and would make sense, but I'm against censorship anyway, so it is what it is. But that'll do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and until next time, take care.
And here's your gold.
Gold? be darned. That's my lunch.